So the hosting space has changed a lot. Yeah, I think there's this like classic trope of a lot of like companies building open source tooling, and you ask them like how they monetize, and they just say hosting. Like they have some like hosted compute product that'll be their like thing, and they'll figure that out at some point in the future. But we have seen like a little bit of a renaissance of hosting platforms. So you mentioned Render, which has been a big one in the space. There's Railway, which we've had on the podcast in the past. So there are these like Heroku alternatives. And then we also have the sort of like serverless world, started with like AWS, but like it's more, I think often of like CloudFlare or Vercel, of like very much what is the minimal amount of infrastructure that you need to think about? How do you just think about the code that you're deploying? There are also like ecosystem constraints to those a lot. So it's like usually JavaScript, for instance. So if you're, more traditional, like full backend framework or whatever, there you kind of like are pushed out of those environments. And I guess I didn't mention Fly.io, which is another important one in the space, in the like kind of Heroku space. So you're talking about kind of like Disco being good for like personal projects, small projects, and it seems like the more like Heroku replacement. So like, how do you position it in the market? Like how do you say, okay, Disco is a good fit if you were thinking about like using Fly.io, for example, instead of that, you could use this in these cases. Like, how do you sort of like pitch it to people?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, we're figuring it out. You see the team here. We've been both like working on it, but also thinking about it. But, I'm not sure that there's a perfect answer. I don't think that there's a universal answer, which is also probably not what you're asking. But I think the one thing that's hard is to say, well, obviously every single web hosting project should be on Disco. Like, that's just so clear to me. That's sort of like, it's good to go through this exercise, which is like, no, we don't think that. We actually are kind of like more also into the idea that, hey, there's a ton of options. I mean, you had DHH on the podcast, right? And like, they've got Kamal, right? Which is this great option. That's a little bit more like Ruby and kind of like Rails oriented, obviously, but quite close. Like there's a lot of like similarities. I was looking at their command line. I was like, oh, this is really neat. I have kind of similar things. They also went like with Docker files and things like that. So I think, this is more about us being the weird new flower in the Renaissance, the garden renaissance of like this kind of like all world. We are looking for like, what is the exact sort of like, because it's like, it's an 8-dimensional thing, right? It's like, you'd have to know where you are in 8 dimensions to be like, I think Disco would be kind of perfect for this. So it is hard also for us to like say it in the way, or just like right now we don't have that perfect elevator pitch, which is if this, but not that. The simplest, or the, in that 8D blob, like the one blob that I can sort of like see the most, is you're at Heroku and you're kind of paying so much that the ratio of what you're getting to what you're paying to what you're using, maybe that's not necessarily out of whack enough, but you're like, like that could be replaced. And then, I mean, because we've had the experience now of moving like big staging, and we can talk about that as well, big staging things off of Heroku, we kind of fit perfectly there because it's like, it's pretty much 1-to-1. You kind of only get advantages. The infra is still at AWS, so it's like reliable enough. The costs go way down. So that works really well. We're also interested in that from we're trying to make it work as a, is it a startup? I guess it is. Of course, yeah. But like the startup shape of what we're trying to do, the managed, like we're trying to also like sell a service. We're also interested in people that are like spending a lot, because it's just like, we kind of feel, this is also like how I go sometimes with personal things or asks or projects. Like, I feel like if a friend asks for a favor, I mean, a friend, you never charge them, but just like, I feel it always easier to be like, yeah, I do free things for people who are like in my neighborhood and my like, and then when like the giantest, most biggest company comes around, it's okay to charge them because they have money. They're making money, we're making money. They don't make money, I don't charge them. And so to me, it's this, again, I'm kind of I think we're applying a bit of the same model. It's like, we're open source and we're open for people who are, both hobbyists or, Mike, the hobbyist pro, whatever, like lots of sites. There's also somebody from Recurse. I don't know if they'd love to be called out, but they're great. their first letter. No, that's even too much. Whatever. Their first letter starts in the second half of the alphabet as well, I'll say. And so try to guess. But they're really amazing. And I know that they're running 70 projects on the box. And we just had this call where we're like, oh my God, like, we were just so happy to be like, it's so funny. They were kind of looking at us, was like, yeah, I'm aware. Like, I'm aware of what I'm doing versus what I could be doing with this. So I was like, okay, that's interesting. That's like a clear case. Because again, they're just paying a lot in management and everything. But on the commercial side, I think it's kind of like what fits us is this sort of Goldilocks that we might have to kind of define in a better way, because it's a little bit of like, I don't know if people should try us first and then feel it out, whether it fits their case. We're even talking like, what would it be a better idea to go through to Kubernetes? And it's something like, maybe if you have like more than 100 microservices, like there are, I don't know if there's like numbers. Maybe it would be good if we had numbers. I don't know, but it's like, there's like a scale of a problem you're solving, or like you'll have enough really complicated networking between your services, or like, Antoine was reminding me, like on Heroku, services can't talk to each other, right? It's like apps, like different apps, right? Different that you deploy can't, like, they don't have like an internal network. And obviously other companies, like maybe, I think Fly has like more of a notion of this network. We are way more of a, like, if you deploy it, it's all kind of like, they all kind of talk on this private thing through the Docker Swarm. So things like that, I think, where it's just like, where there's like a better fit is a little bit easier. Vercel was an interesting case. I'm helping a friend right now, Recurse, who I think I can name. I'm sorry to be so cagey. I just never know if people are like, oh my God, you named me. I feel just bad, but also it's great to name drop. My friend River, who's working on an instrument, and he's working on an instrument in C. The instrument is like just incredible. And he's recompiling it in WASM. And then we're doing like JavaScript stuff on top of that. And the joke was, he was like, well, I'll obviously just deploy this to Vercel. It's the obvious, like everybody does Vercel. And I was like very supportive. I wasn't pushing. I was like, yeah, great. Like I wasn't like, you have to use this code. And it was like, well, wait a second. Like, can you run a C WASM mscripten compiler as part of your build pipeline on Vercel? And like, somebody might be like, yes, you can, you stupid person. And so you're great. But if no one says that, then I am not that stupid. And actually, I don't think you can. And it was like, we're trying to shove this, like, like this build script. And then at some point I felt really bad because I'm not probably good at whatever. I was like, do you mind if I just write 3 lines in one Docker file? I promise. And I am not good at Docker files. So it was like, I was really like, just mscripten, apt-get. And then when it worked, I really did have this moment of like, this is that kind of Goldilocks moment that maybe, again, we should try to like, really explain well, that it's just like, your project is like, complex enough that it's kind of real. I think GitHub pages still make sense if you're only doing a like index.html. I think our site, is it? No, not, we moved over to really dog food, but for a while we had like a GitHub pages for our official website because it's fine. Like if you're really truly like just serving completely static files, it's a great option.
Yeah, the way I see it, a bit like I said earlier, like I see it like a gradient. Like if on one side you have like a Kubernetes or like a totally custom deployments and like Terraform, things like that.
Yeah.
For very complex projects, for like big teams, like you said, like maybe like you have 100 or maybe 800 microservices that need to be deployed separately by separate teams, and they need to talk together, and that's a totally different requirement that like this code doesn't try to tackle. And on the other side of that, like I feel the other extreme would be platforms like Vercel, for example, where you don't really see the infrastructure. It's not something that exists. And on Heroku, you could deploy there, but then maybe you lack some control, like for example, services talking together. If you want if you have your web service, for example, talking with another worker to process something, for example, you need like a message queue to communicate together like that. Or if you want to do like a server-side rendering, for example, you couldn't have like 2 different services to do that. It would be kind of complex. With this code, it's pretty easy to do. So that's one thing. So I think that's kind of the spot where we are is kind of just like between Kubernetes and Heroku, I would say, more closer to Heroku than Kubernetes. And also I think there's a big cost saving in a sense compared to a platform like Heroku, because on Heroku, if you have like let's say a project, you have they call them dynos, but let's call them like servers, for example, or services. If you have like a few services running scaled to like 2 instances, for example, then you might have like 20 services running. You pay for each one of them a large amount. But for Disco, for example, you could run all of them on a single machine for way less than that, because you don't pay like the overhead of like paying for that extra padding of RAM for each of the instances. So that's one thing. And also the fact that like you can deploy, yeah, exactly, deploy many things on the same machine. Basically, I think you can save a lot like that. And I guess I can talk about like the staging environments and things like that. So with my client Ideas, what we've done recently is that we started with a staging environment to Disco. On Heroku, having the staging environment running with all the dynos, database, and things like that, it costs around like $500 a month. Per staging environment. Yeah, exactly. So we moved that to like a single machine that costs like a 50 euro. It's like a snare for like a 50 euro a month. So like already it's like a 10x saving for one staging environment. But then like because the machine was still like so unused, I was able to add like I think 7 other staging environments. So at that point, it's like on Roku we wouldn't have done that because it would have cost way too much. But now it's possible to do. Like it opens new doors because it's not scaling up the pricing because you're using more. Because you can use that padding basically. So like the seven staging environments would have cost maybe $3,000 on Heroku, but now it's still like 50 euros for all of that. And recently I had more projects like just like proof of concepts and things like that, just to not prove a point, but like showing something to someone else. I just created a project, deployed it to Disco. It was super easy. No, the question of the pricing never came to mind because the machine was already there, already paid for, 50 euros a month, and I could just add a project in like 20 seconds, and the project was deployed. And you git push, it deploys the update, so it's very easy to work with.
Yeah. But I think the sort of the question of the platforms, I don't know how kind of fundamental the business model is to the business. I mean, it's sort of absurd to say that, but it's kind of like, it really feels like Amazon leases you infra and they're like, here's bits, you combine them, there's atoms, more atoms, you pay more for them. If they're bigger, you pay more. But they're also, depending on the product, of course, that they have. But a lot of them, they get out of your business. They're not really, like, you have to assemble those things, but they feel more like Legos. And I think, the real thing with everybody else, a little bit, is not that they have like a suspect business model, but it's a bit of like the convenience got so convenient that they started selling the convenience. Like the convenience was the kind of the candy. And it's like, like they kind of, this is the thing. It's like, I understand why. And it made sense. Like git push was the thing that made Heroku. But it's kind of like, because it deployed fast, it's sort of the flip side. You were like, oh yeah, you like that? Like, was real fast, right? Well, yeah, you did it once. And like, wait, you're counting how many times I'm doing that? And obviously, like, I know they don't charge for deploy, which maybe I hope I'm not giving anyone ideas, but I think it is interesting to see those cases of like the people losing the lottery in that they deploy a project and their thing goes viral and then they get a bill. And I'm like, oh, you were popular, so now you're in debt. That sucks. That's the opposite. You should have become popular and now you're poor. It's like, what? Which, because at some point, right, like those limits are more. It's kind of stranger to, I feel, read a pricing page that has. This is a personal thing. I'm not saying anything. This is why we did our thing, because we find that weird. Somebody else might not find that weird, but like there's so many of these moments where like, oh, you're doing how many edge function invocations? And it's like, then there's a number and you're like, well, did I go over 25,000 or 100? Or, I remember a Nolan Royalty, who you might know, who of course famously, did 1 million checkboxes and now he just released 1 million chessboards.com, which is incredible. He definitely, has a thing where he kind of keeps deploying these things that have like the most extreme scale. Like it's just a barrage of users and coming and actions. And he keeps kind of like scaling down his infra. I mean, he's like on a mission to prove something. I think at the end, it will just like run on a stick. Like he just like take a stick from a branch and he'll somehow like connect it to Wi-Fi. No, I'm watching you. But he for sure, I've absolutely seen him think and talk. And I'm even part of a talk that he gives, because at some point he tells me that this thing is going really well. And I go, how's your bandwidth, buddy? You're at DigitalOcean. There's a number that you're not allowed to hit. There is a number of bytes which we also have bandwidth limits. I'm not saying this is some sort of like we have a magical deal with God where like bandwidth doesn't count, but he was just like, that was one thing where he was not allowed. Like it's kind of like the nuclear reactor, like you're kind of turning the knobs. There is a red zone where you suddenly start getting billed. And of course, other platforms are just like they've maybe regulated those things to either happen more often or to happen quickly enough for a big company that you kind of have to get on the horn, and then of course you get it like into a whole pricing conversation, which is very, very different. So anyway, so it's like the pricing is sort of a part of it, and then the flip side, I guess, is just people wanting to own their infra or not think about it, and there's more answers